Welcome to another offseason interview series on Fantasy Football Today, DFS. Today, we welcome another fantasy football expert. His name is Jared Smola at Smola DS. Jared, how are you? Thanks for coming on to the show.
Yeah, glad to be on with you. Pumped to talk some football. We were talking before the show. I'm a big fan of your golf content, but it'll be fun to do a little crossover here and talk some football.
Absolutely. I appreciate you saying that, by the way. And for those of you that are listening, we have done a lot of game theory throughout this summer, talking a lot of just how to play DFS and things of that nature. We've shifted. You noticed last week we had Chris Towers. We were talking just pure football. Last week was the undervalued and sleeper type players that maybe we want to pay attention to from a DFS standpoint. Obviously, there's crossover there with, redraft leagues and, dynasty leagues and all of that stuff. So Jared, I'll tell you, we have now moved to really talking like football and talking players. And that's why I wanted to bring you on because, I follow you on Twitter. I think you're great. I think your content is great. Every day you're pumping out tweets that are extremely relevant, not just to redraft and dynasty, but also to daily fantasy as far as I'm concerned. So thank you for coming on to the show. Let me ask you before we get started, what are you doing now for Draft Sharks? You work for Draft Sharks. Tell us what you do there.
I do a little bit of everything, honestly, because we're a small company. It's just me and a few other guys, full-timers. We have a handful of part-time analysts as well. But it's nice because we just do football. So we are, laser focused on football 365 days a year, which is nice. But yeah, I have my hand in everything, I guess. I kind of head up the projections for the site, but, fuel our rankings, both for your drafts and for, your weekly start sit questions. But I'm, doing content. I'm on the Draft Sharks podcast. We have a YouTube channel. So yeah, I kind of have to do it all.
Well, that's perfect. Well, I'm glad you're on the show. I should have led with what we're talking about with Jared today. It's fresh faces in new places. And as you might deduce from that, we're talking about guys that have moved teams. They're wearing different helmets. They're wearing different uniforms. And I kind of wanted to ask Jared about some of these players, especially some of the more high profile players, in terms of how they might impact this upcoming season, how that shift from team to team is going to impact them, whether it's downward or upward. So I wanted to start with one of the marquee names at one of the marquee positions, Jared, Russell Wilson. Obviously, everybody knows he went from the Seahawks and now is on the Broncos, has quite a few receivers to choose from. And I guess you could have said the same at Seattle, but, I mean, there's at least 4 receivers that he has at his disposal that are kind of high end. Jared, do you agree with that? And just tell us how you think Russell Wilson's going to do this season.
Yeah, I like his spot in Denver here. I think, you could definitely argue, and I think I'd argue that DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett as a 1-2 punch are better than Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton. But I think Wilson's pass catching core in Denver is deeper than he had in Seattle. When you talk about Tim Patrick, we'll see what they get out of KJ Hamler, who tore his ACL early last season, but he should be back for this year. He's a speed guy, someone Russ might like hitting downfield. Better offensive line in Denver than they had in Seattle. And I think the biggest thing, how many years have we talked about the Seahawks being so run heavy under Pete Carroll? And especially last season, they were such a slow-paced offense. They easily ran the fewest offensive snaps in the NFL last year, so that hurt Wilson's production. I think in Denver now, with Nathaniel Hackett coming over from Green Bay, the Packers were top 11 in situation-neutral pass rate each of the past 3 seasons. I think Wilson has a chance to set a career high in passing attempts now that he's finally away from Seattle.
And that's what we want, right? We want volume, especially when you have this many receivers. I think the KJ Hamler point is really interesting. If we assume he's healthy, you add him and his long ball potential to, again, Cortland Sutton, Tim Patrick, Jerry Jeudy. I'm leaving Albert O out of the conversation. I mean, I think Albert O is fine, but the point is, he's got a lot of weapons. And you're right. I agree that Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, if you're just going 2 for 2, are probably 2 better than the best 2 on Denver. But yeah, I agree with you. I think that improved offensive line is really important too. And by the way, from a DFS standpoint, listen, pricing isn't out yet, obviously. We don't know where Russ is going to be sort of cataloged among some of these elite guys, especially some of the guys who have the run potential, like your Josh Allens of the world. Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, they're all in that sort of upper tier conversation. I suspect Russell Wilson will be like the tier right below them from a pricing standpoint. And he starts at Seattle, then he gets Houston at home, then San Francisco, tough defense there, and then he gets at Las Vegas. So just right off the bat from a DFS standpoint, Jared, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems to me that his value won't really be appreciated until maybe after 2 or 3 of these games. So I think maybe you're getting some value by rostering Russell Wilson. Even though he's not a running quarterback, you're getting value rostering him in DFS.
I think so. And you look at the AFC West, man, those are going to be shootouts in that division. So Wilson, just those 6 games, 2 against the Raiders, 2 against the Chargers, 2 against the Chiefs, those are all going to be great spots to stack him up in DFS and then, run it back with someone from the other team.
I wanted to ask you about the AFC West because it's, to me, clearly the most, if intriguing is a vague word, but to me, it's the most intriguing division in football this coming year. You got, and I just, this is in a betting show, but I just wanted to throw this out there. You got the Chiefs at plus 175 to win the division. You got the Chargers at plus 225. I have a lot of respect for what the Chargers did, not just, from a fantasy standpoint and their weapons outside, what they did on the defense in the draft, offensive line. It looks really good. Denver's plus 250. So right in that Chargers zone, and the Raiders are at plus 650. I think this could go so many different ways. And I have kind of like a hot take that maybe the Chiefs actually missed the playoffs and it goes to Denver and the Chargers this year, and KC's on the outside looking in. I just kind of wanted to get your take on where you think the chips fall in the AFC West.
So the Chargers are my Super Bowl pick. I actually bet them right after they signed Khalil Mack. I bet them at 25-1 to win it all. I think they're down to like 18 or 20-1 now, but that'd be where I'd put my money if you're betting a division winner here. And I think you're right. I think Kansas City could definitely finish, third in that division and end up missing the playoffs this season, just because all 4 of those teams, I think have a chance to make the playoffs and even make a run in the playoffs.
Yeah, the Chargers are plus 1,400 now. At least that's on DraftKings. So yeah, you got. And listen, and when it comes to stuff, some of this stuff, you got to get the number early. I think that was a really smart play, Jared. Obviously, it's gone down almost by half. So let's talk. Okay, let's move on from quarterbacks. Actually, I mean, I think Russell Wilson was the high profile guy there. There's some middling running backs that I think are worth talking about, especially when you're considering value. And Chase Edmonds is one of those that come to mind here. Now, he's with the Dolphins, with Raheem Mostert, with Sony Michel. It's very interesting that they've completely revamped their running back core. The last few years, it's really been like 6th-round picks and undrafted free agents that have been showcased on the Miami Dolphins. So this is a completely new regime and a new sort of talent base at running back. And of course, you've got Tyreek Hill there too. An embarrassment of riches in a tough AFC. But let's start with Chase Edmonds. How do you think that's going to shake out?
Yes, I'm sort of following the money when it comes to Miami's backfield. So you look at the contracts these 3 guys got: Edmonds, Mostert, and Michel. Mostert got 1 year, $2.1 million with $1 million guaranteed. Sony Michel got 1 year, $1.75 million with less than $1 million guaranteed. Chase Edmonds got a 2-year deal worth a little over $12 million with a little over $6 million guaranteed. So, to me, it's pretty clear Miami kind of went after Chase Edmonds. And there was an awesome note I saw from Connor Allen of 4for4 earlier this week. So, you talked about the new regime in Miami. Head coach Mike McDaniel comes from San Francisco. So we sort of expect that offense to look somewhat similar to what Kyle Shanahan has run with the Niners. The 49ers last year used zone blocking on the 6th most runs in the NFL. Chase Edmonds led the NFL in yards per carry in zone blocking schemes last season. So he looks like a perfect fit for that offense. It seems like he's the guy that McDaniel kind of pinpointed. It's like, I want him to lead this backfield. I think it's going to be a committee. Like Chase Edmonds is not built to handle, 20 touches a game, but I do think Chase Edmonds is the guy in this Dolphins backfield that you want to be targeting.
Yeah. And speaking of the word targeting, I think it's interesting from a DFS standpoint too, especially DraftKings, where you're getting 1 point per reception. I mean, Chase Edmonds was a guy that was catching a lot of passes and getting a lot of targets, particularly when he was healthy with Arizona. Is that something you think continues? Because when I look at Sony Michel and Raheem Mostert, I'm not thinking pass catching running back.
Right. I mean, I think Evans is going to lead the way in carries. I think he's definitely going to lead that backfield in targets. Now, he has pretty tough target competition when you talk about Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle and even Mike Gesicki. And, Hill and Waddle, especially Waddle, at least last year, worked a lot of that short area stuff. So I could see Edmonds, targets per game actually dipping a bit from what he saw in Arizona last season. But I think the rushing volume is probably going to spike in Miami.
Yeah, I like that call. Okay, so let's move on to Ronald Jones with the Chiefs. Now, I think Ronald Jones is somewhat of a lottery ticket here. I want to get your opinion on this as well. I should note, though, that Jerick McKinnon just re-upped with the Kansas City Chiefs for a one-year deal. I think Jerick McKinnon is just, historically just kind of underrated. People just don't think he's any good. And, it turns out when he actually gets playing time, he's pretty good. Two questions here. What do you think of Ronald Jones? And how much does the Jerick McKinnon signing impact your perception of Ronald Jones?
Well, I think the McKinnon signing impacts Clyde Edwards-Helaire more than Ronald Jones, because I think Clyde Edwards-Helaire is the guy you're hoping handles most of the pass catching work in the Kansas City backfield. Ronald Jones has never been good in the passing game, even going back to his college days. Now, I do think McKinnon is probably more of like an insurance signing. The Chiefs waited 3 months into free agency to re-sign him. He's about to turn 30 years old. And even last season, we all remember McKinnon having a nice playoff run for the Chiefs, but he did very little for them during the regular season. So I do think he's like third in this pecking order. How it's going to shake out between Jones and Edwards-Helaire, we'll see. I'm honestly not a big fan of either guy. I think Jones is probably the best pure runner in Kansas City now, but he's just been so unreliable as far as ball security, and again in the passing game he's not very good. But Clyde Edwards-Helaire has been underwhelming through his first couple seasons too. So it's definitely a backfield we're going to want to figure out and potentially invest in, because it's the Chiefs offense. It's still going to be high scoring offense even without Tyreek Hill, but it's going to be a training camp thing, a preseason thing that hopefully we can figure out how the touches will be divvied between these guys.
Yeah, I totally agree there. So we're going to move on to wide receivers, some of the high profile guys. You guys might be thinking, well, why are they talking about Chase Edmonds and Ronald Jones? Well, first of all, they are going to be relevant, especially from a DFS standpoint, because you're not going to be able to pay up for all the great receivers and all the great running backs and all the great quarterbacks. So I think the question becomes, when you're building your lineups week 1, week 2, week 3, where can you find value? And I think, to your point, Ronald Jones in a 2-down role, depending on how this offense is sort of orchestrated this year, it might be a little different without Tyreek Hill. Maybe they lean on the running game a little bit more with, a decent offensive line. So I think Ronald Jones just being a 2-down back could have some impact. And who knows, maybe week 1, week 2, he's $4,700 or something. And so does he have touchdown equity? Yes. Can he break one off in that offense in particular? Yeah. So again, these are guys to consider in your DFS lineups when the time comes. But let's talk about some of the high profile guys, Jared. Let's talk about Davante Adams. Goes from the Packers, obviously, to the Raiders. This is a high-profile signing. He gets to kind of reunite with his college buddy, Derek Carr. Derek Carr, I think, is very much under the radar. When we had Chris Towers on from CBS Sports last week, and I talked about Derek Carr. We talked about Derek Carr as an undervalued guy, both in redraft and DFS, 2 QB leagues, things of that nature. What do you think about Davante this year?
I think it'd be tough to say that the move from Green Bay to Vegas isn't a downgrade for his fantasy stock. I don't think it's a huge downgrade, though. I'm with you. I think Derek Carr is a solid quarterback. He was top 7 in the NFL last year in passing yards, completion rate, and yards per attempt, and that was without Davante Adams. The bigger concern for me, probably with Adams, is what happens to his target share with, I think, tougher target competition in Vegas in Darren Waller and Hunter Renfrow. But man, I'm kind of a believer in great players earn their targets, and Waller and Renfrow are probably going to suffer more than Davante Adams with this move. I think his target volume's going to be fine. To me, Adams is still a top 5 wide receiver.
Yeah, I agree. I think, again, from a DFS standpoint, I wonder, because I agree with everything you just said, but I feel like what you just said was you still like him, but you don't necessarily love him, at least not as much as you did in Green Bay, because I think in Green Bay, he'd be a clear cut, probably top 2 or top 3 receiver. Here, we might be thinking in redraft leagues, maybe he's in the 4 or 5 range in some people's eyes. So with that in mind, and maybe that's crazy to some people, but I think the larger point from a DFS standpoint for me is he's going to be priced really high. And I just wonder if I don't think I want to bite there. You know what I mean? I think game 1, they play the Chargers. Maybe I do want to bite there, or maybe I want to pivot and go on to somebody like a Darren Waller, or maybe even a Hunter Renfrow, or something crazy like a Josh Jacobs, and just assume it's going to be, a few touchdowns, run in there. I don't know that I'm going to want to pay the price tag for Davante Adams, but I do think a lot of people will. I think they'll be intrigued enough to play Davante Adams. So I think he's super, super interesting, but obviously still a talent.
Yeah, we'll see where he's priced. To me, Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson, and Jamar Chase are the clear top 3 fantasy wide receivers heading into the season. Then it's Stephon Diggs, Davante Adams, CD Lamb is in that mix for me. So he's kind of in that second tier now.
Yeah.
I do like that he's going to be in all these AFC West shootouts. I think that's going to help his weekly upside for DFS at least.
100%. So speaking of second tier, or maybe third tier, I'd like to get your sort of redraft opinion on Tyreek Hill. How do we feel about Tyreek Hill this year, going, of course, from the Chiefs to the Miami Dolphins, led by Tua?
Kind of the same deal here with Tyreek as we talked about with Adams. Like, I think it's obviously a quarterback downgrade. It's probably a downgrade in, total offensive situation. You talk about, Andy Reid to me is one of the best play callers in the NFL. Mike McDaniel's, a total unknown, at least as a head coach. But just with Davante Adams, Tyreek Hill is such a great player. He's going to be fine. I think people think of him as like this, guy that relies on deep balls. His average depth of target in Kansas City last year was middle of the pack. It was 11.0 yards. That was 43rd out of 84 qualifying wide receivers. He does a lot of stuff in the short range of the field, get the ball in his hands. I think that's where he's going to be good in Miami with Tua, who is accurate on their shorter range passes. I also think too with Mike McDaniel, we just saw what Debo did as a ball carrier in San Francisco. I don't think Tyreek's going to get that type of ball carrying volume, but I do think McDaniel is going to want to get him the ball on the ground 1 to 2 or 3 times a game.
Yeah, and the truth is, if his ADOT goes down, which it did last year, in terms of Tyreek Hill, that's okay, right? I mean, what he can do after the catch is huge, and it kind of like it's a nice segue to AJ Brown, who I want to talk about next, because some of these receivers are doing so much after the catch that you almost prefer the ADOT to be down, especially when you have a guy like Tua as your quarterback. Like, no offense to Tua, but I just don't think the deep ball is going to be there for him. He doesn't throw the ball deep anyway. I think he was, bottom 5 in terms of deep ball attempts last year. So I don't really have a problem with that, I guess is my larger point. AJ Brown, Titans to the Eagles. This one's really interesting. I'd like to get your take on how you think he's going to do. Production, targets, do they go? I mean, he's coming from Tennessee, so do they go down? I'm not 100% sure. I'd like to get your take there. And I'd also like to hear how you think that affects Davante Smith.
So to me, the big question in Philadelphia heading into this season is what their run pass split is going to be, because last year I have never seen a team shift like the Eagles did midway through last season. So over the first 6 weeks of the season, they were the 5th pass heaviest offense if you look at just neutral situations. So that's when down and distance and the scoreboard isn't impacting play calling. So they were the 5th pass heaviest offense through week 6. From week 7 on, they were the 4th run heaviest offense. They totally shifted gears. Now I think you make that big trade for AJ Brown after drafting Davante Smith in the first round last year. Like, I think they want to shift back towards the pass this season. The big question is just, how much more do they shift back? Because, to me, if Brown's going to finish as a wide receiver 1, the Eagles are going to have to shift quite a bit, because it is tough target competition. You mentioned Davante Smith there. Dallas Goedert, I think, is still going to see his fair share of targets. Mm-hmm. So that's the big question for me in Philadelphia, and that's going to impact Brown's fantasy value.
And I think that's a really good reason to maybe be cautious in drafting AJ Brown in your redraft leagues, but maybe you spike with him in DFS. I mean, for example, he's at Detroit week 1, Minnesota, then at Washington, Jacksonville, at Arizona. That's his first 5 weeks. Then he gets Dallas at home. Those are all games before the week 7 bye for them. Now, granted, he could just be great in those 6 games, but the point is, if you don't want to take, I think this is kind of the beauty of having DFS in year-long fantasy leagues, is that, if you miss out on AJ Brown in your draft because you just don't see the value as much as the guy that's drafting next to you, I mean, I think he could have some big games, and that includes week 1 at Detroit. I mean, I absolutely think that could be a huge game, because we don't know what's coming from Philly. I think people will want to play Jalen Hurts. It's just a question of, well, do you want to pair him with AJ Brown? Maybe you play Jalen Hurts naked, but again, that's up to the user, but I think it's really interesting. It's going to be really interesting to see how he does in those first few weeks, because he can expose those offenses for sure, or those defenses for sure.
Yeah, I mean, Brown has been a perfect GPP play throughout his career so far, and in Tennessee, and I think that's going to continue in Philly. I don't think he's going to finish among the top 10 wide receivers and targets this season, but I do think there's going to be games where he gets 7, 8, 9 targets, and he does have that big playability. And I'm just buying this Eagles offense in general. I think, again, AJ Brown, Davante Smith, Dallas Goedert, that's a really strong top 3. And I'm a believer in Jalen Hurts. I think he's still improving as a passer, and he's already one of the best running quarterbacks in the NFL.
I'll be reaching, and we talked about Jalen Hurts quite a bit last week with Chris Towers. I'll be reaching a bit early for Jalen Hurts because I just with what he can do in the passing game with the core that he has, and what we know he can do with his rushing. I mean, I think it was last year. I think it was, I'm going off memory, 9 rushes per game. That was his average, and that includes some time with a sprained ankle. So I just think the sky is the limit from a fantasy standpoint with Jalen Hurts. Real quick question here though: NFC East, who wins it?
I'm going Dallas still. I think they're the most well-rounded team. I think, Philly would be a close second for me, but I'd go with Dallas. I'm not sure what the odds say for that division.
Yeah, Dallas is still a pretty big favorite, but yeah, I think Dallas. Listen, I actually think it's going to be Philly that wins the NFC East because I think Dallas is leaking oil a little bit, but I do think it's somewhat of a coin flip. You're probably getting some value betting Philly because I do know that Dallas is still like a decent favorite there. So listen, we're going to talk about a few more receivers, and we're going to talk about a couple tight ends. Again, fresh faces in new places, guys that have shifted teams here. But first, we're going to get a message from our partners. And we are back with Jared Smola. We're talking about fresh faces in new places. We just got finished talking about A.J. Brown and what I think is going to be a high-flying Eagles squad. Let's go to the Browns, though. I don't know how high-flying they're going to be, but they have Amari Cooper. They have a huge question at quarterback. Amari Cooper obviously comes from the Cowboys to the Cleveland Browns. Jared, what say you on Amari Cooper?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the quarterback question, and that's the big thing here. Like, how many games, if any, are the Browns going to get out of Deshaun Watson this season? Because as it stands now, Jacoby Brissett would be their guy. I'm assuming Baker Mayfield is gone. So it'd be Jacoby Brissett if Watson misses any games or if he misses the season. So that's the big question there. It's a great opportunity for Cooper, though, from a volume perspective. I think the Browns lost a combined 229 targets from last year with the departures of Jarvis Landry, Austin Hooper, Rashard Higgins, and then, Odell Beckham spent the first half of the season with Cleveland. So that was 44% of the Browns' targets from last year that are gone. So I do think Cooper is going to come in and, be the clear alpha there, maybe even set a career high in targets. It just, again, it comes down to what kind of quarterback play he's going to get.
Yeah, let's assume for the sake of argument that for most of the season, they have a competent quarterback, whoever that may be. Maybe it's Baker, probably not. Maybe Jacoby Brissett plays okay. Maybe it's Deshaun Watson. Who knows? I'm just curious if it's not Amari Cooper, and let's say we're talking DFS as like a flyer. Donovan Peoples-Jones comes to mind. Is he a guy you'd speculate on the Browns? It's just kind of like a low-priced, a low-rent guy in week 1, 2, or 3, depending on the matchup.
Yeah, I like Peoples-Jones. He's a guy I liked coming out of college, and I think he's flashed through his first couple seasons here. And I just think if we're talking, DFS GPPs, I do like David Bell as well. Their rookie. I think, he's probably gonna be their starting slot receiver. I just think I don't think he's gonna offer the same weekly ceiling that Peoples-Jones is gonna offer because DPJ is more of the downfield threat for them. I also think there's been a lot of talk of Cleveland looking to add a wide receiver still. Julio Jones still out there, Will Fuller still out there. So I think there's a chance that Peoples-Jones isn't a starter come week 1.
Very professional setup, Jared, for another great segue, because we're going to talk about Allen Robinson from the Bears to the Rams. But the reason I think that's a great segue is because Odell Beckham is still out there. And there were reports today that he is in conversations with the Los Angeles Rams to re-up with them, presumably on a 1 or 2 year deal coming off that ACL injury. He's not going to be ready week 1 or week 2. I think that's probably why everybody's just kind of holding off on Odell Beckham. But we have Allen Robinson there now. Definitely a different type of receiver. What type of impact do you think Allen Robinson has there as presumably the number 2 receiver?
I think so. Yeah. I don't think Odell Beckham's going to be much of a factor this season. If you read the quotes in that article from today from the Rams front office, they were basically saying like, we're not going to sign this guy yet because he's just not going to be a factor early in the season. Like he's a guy who maybe the tail end of the regular season into the playoffs could help us. Cause you remember Beckham tore his ACL in the Super Bowl. So like the 9-month timetable puts him into October or November before he'd be ready to go. So I do think Robinson's going to be the number 2 guy in Los Angeles. And he got a pretty nice contract from the Rams. The concern with A-Rob, he just wasn't good last year. And I know the situation was, rough with, the Bears offense and their quarterback play. But you look at, stuff like Pro Football Focus receiving grades, yards per route run. He was in the bottom 20 among wide receivers, and his teammate Darnell Mooney was much better in those efficiency metrics. So, my question is is Robinson just kind of past his peak now on the decline? He's only 29 in August, so I kind of want to bet on a bounce back, especially since he's going to a much, much, much better offense now. But his 2021 season was definitely concerning.
Yeah, I'm definitely very intrigued by, from a DFS standpoint, what Allen Robinson's price might be in those first few weeks. Like, how much is the market, and I'm talking like DraftKings or FanDuel, for example, respecting Allen Robinson? Because to your point, when we talk about the metrics last year, I don't know that it warrants much respect in terms of just like being high priced. Because if he's a guy that's like, 5,400 or 5,600, right out of the gate, I think it's certainly worth maybe throwing him in a couple of lineups, a couple stacks, something like that. But yeah, it's really too bad, right? He finally gets a quarterback, but he's, almost 30 years old. I mean, this guy literally hasn't had a good quarterback. Even in college, his quarterback was Christian Hackenberg, if I recall correctly. So, tough scene there, but I'm hoping for the best for him with the Rams. Another guy that I think is really intriguing, Jared, Marquise Brown, going from Lamar Jackson and company to Kyler Murray, the Arizona Cardinals. I think this is a pretty good spot for him, especially when you look at the receiving core that they have and Kyler Murray's deep ball. Pretty great. Jared, what do you think about Marquise Brown?
I love this spot for Marquise Brown. So there's obviously opportunity for him. Christian Kirk leaves behind 103 targets from a year ago. Chase Edmonds leaves behind 53 targets. And then, of course, you have DeAndre Hopkins suspended for the first 6 games of the season. So even like right out of the gate, I think Marquise Brown's going to play a big role in this offense. He has some chemistry with Kyler Murray. They spent a couple seasons together at Oklahoma. Marquise Brown went for over 1,300 yards in his final season with Kyler Murray. And then you mentioned the deep ball stuff, which is obviously a big part of Marquise Brown's game. Only 27% of Marquise Brown's targets of 20-plus yards downfield were deemed catchable last year by Pro Football Focus. So that was obviously an issue for Marquise Brown. Kyler Murray last year, the best PFF passing grade on deep balls, the second best adjusted completion rate on deep balls. So if nothing else, Brown's getting a big upgrade, I think, in the deep passing game, which is kind of, I think, the best facet of his game.
Yeah, I look at their schedule early, and they get Kansas City at home. That's the biggest total of the week in week 1. I believe it's 53, and then week 2 they're at Las Vegas. So I mean, I think that's your case study on Marquise Brown. I mean, it's a small sample size, but more importantly, I think it's your case study on Kyler Murray, because I think a lot of people are down on Kyler Murray, and it makes sense, right? The last 2 seasons, second half of the season, it's not just the injuries. It looks like they've sort of game planned him out of being a successful quarterback. But, and Jared, maybe you disagree with that. I'm not sure. But the point is, I think these first 2 weeks, it could be like another kind of third coming out party for Kyler Murray. I do want to ask you about that, though. When it comes to Kyler Murray, have they sort of schemed him properly and figured him out? I mean, I know he still can be a dynamic quarterback. My question for you is, can he do it on a consistent level? Because it doesn't look like it right now.
It just seems like that Kingsbury offense gets stale over the second half of seasons, and like the defense makes adjustments against it, and then Kingsbury doesn't know how to react to that. And you mentioned the injuries. Kyler's dealt with those too, and he is an undersized guy, so that's definitely concerning. Their offensive line is probably the biggest concern for me. It was pretty bad last year, and they didn't do anything to upgrade it in the offseason. But I'm still buying Murray and this offense again. I just think the weapons are there. I love the addition of Marquise Brown. I'm still kind of excited about Rondale Moore, even though last year was kind of disappointing. But I'm buying this Cardinals offense.
Yeah, fair enough. And certainly in the first couple weeks, I mean, he will probably be chalky. And I'm talking about both Marquise Brown and Kyler Murray. But I think it's definitely something to consider. That first game against Kansas City, listen, there's going to be a lot of people on that game. There's other games to pivot to, including that Chargers game that we spoke of. There's 3 or 4 games to pivot to that have pretty high totals, but that one is going to have a lot of intrigue, and there's going to be a lot of ownership on both sides of the ball there. Last receiver, before we get into a couple tight ends, JuJu Smith-Schuster. Now, I can tell you, Chris Towers and I talked about him quite a bit last week. And the conclusion that I came to was just kind of by process of elimination, JuJu appears to be the guy, especially early in the season, that just might load up on the targets, regardless of whether the efficiency has been down. But I wanted to get your thoughts here.
Yeah, of course, completely remade Chiefs wide receiver core with Tyreek Hill out of there. Then they had JuJu, and they also had Marquez Valdes-Scantling, and then they draft Sky Moore. So that's a big question fantasy owners are going to have to answer this summer is what that packing order is going to look like. I mean, JuJu, there has never been a more Jekyll and Hyde start to an NFL career than what we've seen from JuJu Smith-Schuster. I mean, he scored the 8th most PPR points by a wide receiver through the first 2 seasons of a career in NFL history. And then he's just been bad the past 3 years. And, it's been iffy quarterback playing in Pittsburgh, and JuJu's had injuries that he's dealt with. But even if you look at, a stat like yards per route run, like JuJu's teammates have been more efficient than him in Pittsburgh. So that's definitely a concern. But I think he to me is best equipped to take over that number 1 wide receiver role in Kansas City. I mean, Sky Moore is a rookie coming from the MAC. And then Marquez Valdes-Scantling, throughout his career in Green Bay, has kind of just been a deep ball specialist. So I think JuJu right now would be my pick to lead those wide receivers in targets.
Yeah, any thoughts there on Sky Moore? I mean, I think the easy argument there, and the argument that I would make is, well, he's a rookie from Western Michigan, probably not going to be super high impact in this offense, the first few weeks. To me, that just, and I might be wrong, obviously, but to me, that just really gives JuJu that bump, because you said, MVS is not exactly a target monster. Neither is McCole Hardman. I just, other than Travis Kelce, who's going to, certainly benefit a little bit here too, I think it's JuJu's.
Yeah, kind of by process of elimination for me, at least out of the gate. I mean, to me, Sky Moore was a great looking prospect. Coming into the league, got round 2 draft capital, landed in a great spot with the Chiefs. Obviously, I do think he can make an impact this season. And again, JuJu and MVS both have their warts. Like I don't want to go all in on those guys. So I think especially as we get to the second half of the season, I think you could see Sky Moore make a pretty big impact.
Yeah, fair enough. Let's talk about a couple tight ends now, Jared. Let's start with, speaking of enigmas. I mean, you talked about Jekyll and Hyde with JuJu Smith-Schuster. Now, this is an enigma and a Jekyll and Hyde to a much lesser degree than JuJu, of course. But Evan Engram looks like a pretty good talent. And I don't know what it is. I mean, to me, when I watch him, I'm like, the kid's just not focused. I mean, I know that's like a really arbitrary thing for me to say, but I don't know how to explain the talent and just the not fulfilling of the talent. So where are we at with Evan Engram, who goes, of course, from Daniel Jones and company to the Jacksonville Jaguars to join Christian Kirk, another new teammate on that team?
Yeah, I really did not want to be in on Evan Engram again this season, because I've been a buyer for most of his career, and it's been frustrating. But first of all, if you get in some of these early fantasy drafts, he is going so late. Like, he's outside the top 25 tight ends in ADP. So it's tough for me not to buy at that price for a guy like you said, who has flashed talent. He's a first round pick. He's a big time athlete. Still only 28 years old in September. So he's still, not at an age where I'm worried about him dropping off. And I like this landing spot in Jacksonville. Jacksonville only gave him a 1-year deal, but he got $9 million. So it was a pretty big investment. You look at Doug Peterson, he's the new head coach for the Jags. You look at his time with the Eagles, and Eagles tight ends averaged a 32% target share in those 5 seasons that Peterson was in Philadelphia. Now, they had Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert for part of that time, so that definitely pushed targets to that position. But I do think the tight end is a big part of Peterson's offense. And again, the fact that they gave Evan Engram $9 million this year kind of tells me they want him to be a big part of that passing game.
Totally agree. And I love that 32% stat. I mean, that's pretty significant, right?
It's huge. Yeah, it's huge. The league average is around 20%.
Right. So yeah, no, that's really interesting. Looking at the schedule, especially on the front end, it doesn't look super appetizing. They do play Washington week 1, and I don't know exactly what to expect from that defense. Then it's Indy week 2, at the Chargers week 3, at Philadelphia. It eases up after that a little bit. But yeah, I think Evan Ingram's really, really interesting, especially from a DFS standpoint. Again, do you want to count, Jared, you've been burned by Evan Engram. Do you want to count on him for, 17, 18 weeks, or do you want to count on him for some, spot duty, week 1 or week 5 or week 8? I think he is kind of the prototypical guy that, listen, if you don't want to get a share of him in your redraft leagues, then, come over to DFS, come over to DraftKings and just play him. I like that play. Noah Fant is the other tight end that we want to talk about here, Jared. Goes, of course, from the Broncos. Man, I'd love to see him on the Broncos with what we, with Russell Wilson and these 4 receivers that we talked about. But he goes from the Broncos to the Seahawks. So we don't really have a quarterback there. I'd love to get your thoughts on the quarterback situation, but more importantly, how do you think Noah Fant's going to do on his new team?
Yeah, the quarterback situation is not good. That's kind of the extent of my thoughts on Seattle's quarterback situation. I love Noah Fant, the player. Former first-round pick, elite athlete. He actually has the 24th most PPR points by a tight end through his first 3 seasons in NFL history. So it's been a good start to his career. But like you were talking about, just a tough situation in Seattle. You have the quarterback issues. You have DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, who are really tough target competition. And then again, I mentioned this before, but last year Seahawks were 32nd in offensive plays. They were 24th in situation neutral pass rate, 31st in pass attempts, and that was with Russell Wilson for most of the season. Now that it's going to be Drew Lock or Geno Smith, that's going to remain a run heavy offense. So it's kind of tough to get excited about Noah Fant in Seattle, at least for this year.
Yeah, and the first couple of weeks of the season, he's got Denver, he's got at San Francisco, not great there. And then, of course, it eases up Atlanta and Detroit. So the one thing I do want to stress, and we talked about this a little, Jared, when it came to the game theory, sort of a offseason series, things we were doing. Andrew Erickson came on, Josh Larkey, TJ Hernandez, a bunch of others. We're going to get in the first couple of weeks, like people are just going to determine that this is the way it is with certain teams, with certain offenses and defenses, offensive lines, matchups. And we know that's not the case. So what I want to stress to the listener is, just because you've got a 2-week sample size of, let's say, Noah Fant having no production. Now, he's probably a bad example to bring up because he truly doesn't really have a quarterback. But with that said, use people's perceptions against them when it comes to, just sample sizes that aren't really legitimate. And so I think maybe Seattle's a good example of that. Yeah. They're going to get roasted in the first couple of weeks. Like they are I don't know what the lines are, but they're losing at home to Denver and they will lose at San Francisco. To me, that could be, double digits in both of those, but then they get Atlanta at home and at Detroit, they get a chance to rebound. That's when you want to look at some of these guys who are like bargain pricing because of what the perception is of them at that point.
Well, I think that point about not getting too anchored to what we see over the first couple of weeks of the season is perfect for this show because I think it especially applies to these guys on new teams, right? I think it's not surprising if any of these guys get off to slow starts just because they're learning new offenses, they're playing with new quarterbacks. Like it could be a slow start for some or all of these guys, but I think, they should get better throughout the season.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Being on a new team, there is an adjustment period for most of these guys. So pounce on them when the perception is, hey, maybe it's just not going to work out for that guy on his new team because that's probably a misperception. Jared, you're doing so much at Draft Sharks. Can you maybe tell us what you got? Anything coming up soon? Like anything you're putting out? I know on Twitter. I mean, again, if you don't follow Jared, it's at Smola DS, SMOLADS. I know you put out a lot of great content there, but where else can people find your content? And do you have anything coming up soon?
Yeah, so we're actually just wrapping up all of our 2022 player profiles on Draft Sharks. That's where a lot of these nuggets I've been posting on Twitter are coming from because I'm doing deep dives into all these teams and all these players. So so these profiles, I think they're the most detailed season previews you're going to find, and we have them for like 250 players. So basically any draftable player, you're going to find a profile on Draft Sharks. Those are for our members, but we're also posting some free ones, so you can check those out on the site. And then we also have our full rankings and projections up. They've actually been up for a few months now. We post them before the NFL draft and just constantly keep them updated because nowadays we're drafting starting in like February and it goes right through up until week 1. So our projections are always up and they're always updated.
I love that. Up and updated. That second part is pretty critical because sometimes you don't know when people are updating their content. It sounds like you, Jared, and the guys over at Draft Sharks are doing that quite often. So listen, that closes our show with Jared Smola, Fresh Faces, New Places. We are going to come back to you right next week with another football show with another kind of, hey, let's talk about some of these guys that we're actually maybe going to be rostering on our DFS squads week 1, week 2, week 3, kind of the high impact guys early. We're going to maybe get into some best ball stuff as well. So tune in. We'll have another show for you next week. Thanks, Jared.
Thanks, Sia. That was fun.